Hi, I'm Morgan, and today I will be reading Chapter 6 of Charities Chosen by Ruby M. Ayres. Chapter 6. During the next few weeks, Charity learned quite a lot about people in general, and her own relations in particular. She had vaguely understood that her uncle was a dour, uncommunicative man, and she was surprised to find that he was neither the one thing nor the other. When the first natural restraint and shyness which existed between them wore off, they talked together a great deal, and after a few days, Charity shrewdly discovered that her uncle's chief trial in life was his family. She began to wonder why he had ever married his wife, not guessing that Mrs. Atfield, even as a girl, had been sufficiently clever and calculating to marry the man of her choice, no matter whether he were willing or not. She had foreseen a wonderful future for the studious young man, who took no trouble to hide his great shyness from her, but none of her dreams had been realized, much to her bitter chagrin. Another thing which Charity discovered was the lack of affection between her uncle and his children. In a way, he was proud of them, proud of Myrtle's beauty and of his son's popularity, but their lives lay so far apart that it was almost impossible for him to take any interest in what they did. Charity gathered that he did not share his wife's determination that Myrtle must marry for money. "Happiness is the greatest thing in life," he said once, when speaking of his daughter. "Why cannot people be contented with that, and nothing more?" One day Charity spoke of Heather. She had not seen him since Myrtle sent her to his flat, but she had heard Harvey say that he was going away, and she longed to know if it was true. But her uncle seemed to know very little about Heather. "He used to come here at one time," he admitted, "but your aunt discouraged his visits. I believe he is not a very desirable young man, although he is a great friend of Harvey's." Charity privately thought he was a good deal more desirable than Harvey, but she dared not say so, and she went on silently sorting books. She had never seen so many books in her life, and presently she looked up from her task and across the room to where her uncle sat. "How many of these have you read?" she asked. He smiled at her absently. "I have read them all at one time or another," he answered, and I should dearly love to read them all again, but my life will not be long enough." He returned to his papers, and Charity went on with her work. She was quite happy now. She was usefully occupied, and the time seemed to fly. The half-made jumper had been pushed into a drawer and forgotten, and when Miss Bleat came to the house to sew, Charity was too busy to talk to her. One evening, a week after she had started to catalogue her uncle's books, Mrs. Atfield sent for her. Charity obeyed the summons reluctantly. Lately her aunt had left her severely alone. But to her surprise, she found Mrs. Atfield all smiles and good temper. She even stopped and kissed Charity with affection, and asked how the books were progressing, and if she found the work very dull. "Oh, no, I love it," Charity answered with enthusiasm, "and I think Uncle is a perfect dear." Mrs. Atfield looked amazed. It was so long since she had considered her husband as other than a money-making machine, that she had almost lost sight of the fact that he was a human being. After a moment she said, "Oh, well," in a long-suffering sort of voice, and asked Charity to sit down. "I have something to tell you," she said with a pleased little air of mystification. "Yes," said Charity politely, but she was not really interested. She was sure it could be nothing which would concern her, and she was right, for Mrs. Atfield said triumphantly, "Myrtle is engaged to be married." Charity jumped out of her seat, her eyes wild with excitement. "To Mr. Heather," she gasped, and was instantly frozen by her aunt's steely gaze. "Certainly not to Mr. Heather," she was informed coldly. "Mr. Heather is the most undesirable person. Myrtle is engaged to a gentleman named Richard Pelham, and he is an honorable—" Charity knit her dark brows. "Richard Pelham," she repeated vaguely. "Yes, I've heard of him. I can't remember where, but I have heard of him. He is coming to dinner tonight," her aunt went on placidly, and as you have been so very good lately, you may come down to dinner." Charity flushed crimson. "Thank you, but I don't want to." Mrs. Atfield's face changed. "You will do as I tell you," she said sharply, "and you will wear the white frock of Myrtle's, which I have had altered for you, and you will please remember to behave yourself. Now you can go." Charity obeyed, her cheeks crimson, her eyes furious. To be ordered about in such a manner made her blood boil. For nearly a month she had kept hidden away as if she were someone to be ashamed of. And tonight, because it suited some plan of her aunt's, she was to dress up and come down to dinner and behave. It was the first time she had been asked to take a meal with the family, and she made up her mind that she would not obey. But on the stairs she met Myrtle, a sad, defiant-looking Myrtle, who raised ashamed eyes to Charity's face as she asked, "Well, has Mother told you?" "Yes." Myrtle laughed miserably. "You don't have to congratulate me." Impulsively, Charity took her hand. "How can I?" Myrtle jerked her hand away. "Why not? Everyone is saying how lucky I am. He will have a title and tons of money, and he has given me a ring which costs £400. Charity caught her breath hard. £400? She gasped. Myrtle nodded. There was a little silence. Then Charity said staunchly, "I'd rather have Mr. Heather with 400 pence. The color flamed into Myrtle's face. "I forbid you ever to mention him to me again," she cried passionately. "It's his fault. I've done what I have. All his fault." Then she turned and ran away. Charity changed her mind and her frock and went down to dinner. It was just a family affair, her uncle and aunt, and Myrtle and Harvey, and Richard Pelham. Pelham was late in arriving, and Mrs. Atfield fumed and fretted and glanced at the clock 100 times, as if even now she was afraid that this eligible prize might slip through her hands. Harvey grinned at his mother's anxiety. "Changed his mind, perhaps," he said with an unkind glance at his sister. But even as he spoke, the bell rang, and Pelham was announced. Charity was standing by the fire, feeling shy and unwanted. It embarrassed her because Harvey kept staring at her, and because when she first entered the room he had said something about the ugly duckling. Charity had disliked Harvey from the first moment of their meeting, but she did know that she was looking quite her best in Myrtle's altered frock, with its fluffy feather trimming and low-cut neck. She had never before worn an evening gown, and she held her quaint head with its shock of dark hair with a new pride and dignity. All the evening she had been wishing Hugh Heather could see her, and she was wishing it still, as she turned without any curiosity to look at Richard Pelham. Then she gave a stifled exclamation. "Goodness! It's you!" The next moment she blushed fiery red and looked as if she wished the earth would open and swallow her up, for the eyes of the entire family were upon her in amazed disapproval, and Pelham himself was looking anything but pleased. There was an awkward silence, into which her aunt dropped an icy question. "Have you met my niece before, Richard?" Charity blundered in, anxious to rectify her mistake and thereby making matters worse. "Yes, he has, but he didn't know it was me. I never told him my name, and I thought he was a taxi man. He gave me a lift in his car, you see, and so—" She broke off in confusion, and Pelham said quietly, "That is perfectly correct. I met this lady in the rain one night. She had no umbrella, and so—" "It wasn't raining," said Charity impulsively. The awkward silence was broken by a servant announcing dinner. Charity found herself next to Harvey at table. "I say, is that true about Pelham giving you a lift in his car?" he asked in an undertone. Charity raised indignant eyes. "Of course it is. I never tell lies." He chuckled. "Myrtle looked mad," he said cheerfully. Charity frowned. She was trying to remember what it was Heather had said about Richard Pelham, and suddenly with a rush it all came back to her. His anger, his furious words. That swine! Yes, he had called the man to whom Myrtle was engaged a swine! Charity was filled with dismay. What would Heather say when he knew? Why he had even asked her to give him her word of honor not to see Pelham again. Why he had even asked her to give him her word of honor not to see Pelham again. She, for whom he cared nothing, and now Myrtle, for whom he cared much, was to marry the man? She turned to Harvey. "Is Mr. Heather away?" "Yes, he's gone to Monte Carlo," Charity gasped. "Monte Carlo? I thought you had to have a lot of money to go there. I suppose he hopes to make a lot." Charity relapsed into silence. The ways of the world were sometimes beyond her comprehension, so of course Heather knew nothing of this engagement. She looked across at Pelham with resentful eyes. He was a good-looking man, in rather a too immaculate way. He had auburn-colored hair which waved where it parted, and very perfect teeth, which somehow aggravated Charity. "Everything about him is just too beautiful for words," she told herself, as she took in the details of his immaculate clothes and his polished fingernails. "I wonder if he always looks like that." He was devoting himself to Myrtle, and Mrs. Atfield beamed on them both. At the head of the table her husband sat almost silent, except when spoken to, looking a little preoccupied and grave, and Charity thought, "He's hating it. He knows they don't really love one another." Then her thoughts went back to Heather and she sighed. The world seemed upside down. When dinner was over, she tried to slip away, but Harvey stopped her. "Oh, I say don't go. It's dull enough as it is." Charity scowled at him. "It won't be any brighter if I stay." "It won't be any brighter if I stay," she said bluntly, "and I've got some work to finish." He looked incredulous. "Work? You?" "Yes, we're not all as lazy as you are," she retorted. "I'm making a catalogue of your father's books." He stared at her blankly. "Oh, good Lord!" he ejaculated. "I didn't know the governor ever allowed his precious books to be touched." "He asked me to do them," Charity said proudly. She turned to the library, and after a moment Harvey followed. The evening bored him, and he found Charity better than no amusement, so he lounged after her and fell into one of the big armchairs, watching her with a curious expression in his eyes. "I say," he broke out suddenly, "I've never met a girl like you before, you know." Charity went on with her sorting, her slim hands moving very swiftly and skillfully over the dark bindings. "Is that a compliment?" she asked. "Hanged if I know," said Harvey. He was piqued by her lack of interest and was forced to admit to himself that tonight, at all events, she was looking almost pretty. His curiosity had been aroused by her admission of friendship with Pelham, whose reputation as regards women was well known. Perhaps, after all, she was not the unsophisticated innocent he had imagined her to be. She certainly looked very provoking in her white frock. A little gleam filled his eyes as he said suddenly, "I suppose you'd box my ears if I kissed you, eh?" Charity raised her head for the fraction of a second, and sent him a lightning glance. "Try me and see," she said serenely. Harvey laughed. "Thanks, but I don't think I will, not yet, anyway," he answered coolly. And that is the end of Chapter 6 of Charity's Chosen by Ruby M. Ayres. Thank you for listening to this chapter with me, and I hope you join me soon for the next one. Have a great day!